The plaza outside the Grand Meridian Hotel glittered like a monument to excess. Marble tiles polished so smooth they reflected the sky. Fountains breathing mist into the warm evening air, and a line of luxury cars idling like obedient beasts waiting for their masters. Cameras flashed nonstop because tonight was not just another charity gala. It was his night. Damien Cross, the billionaire whose name moved markets and silence rooms, had arrived. He stepped out of his black limousine wearing a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people's yearly rent. His posture calm, controlled, almost rehearsed. Damien was a man who had learned long ago that power was quiet. He smiled slightly for the cameras, nodded at donors, accepted praise like it was his natural right. People whispered his story in fragments. Self-made, ruthless, visionary, untouchable. To the world, he was success incarnate. But just as he lifted his hand to wave, the air shifted. A woman emerged from the crowd, not dressed in glitter or borrowed elegance, but in a simple black dress that clung to her frame like it carried memories instead of fabric. Her hair was pulled back tightly, her jaw set, her eyes burning with something far deeper than anger. For a heartbeat, Damien didn't recognize her. Then he did, and his smile faltered. The woman was Lena Harper, his ex, the one chapter of his life he had sealed shut and buried beneath wealth, lawyers, and time. Before anyone could react, before security could move, before Damien could even speak her name, Lena stepped forward and slapped him across the face. The sound was sharp, violent, unmistakable. It cracked through the plaza like thunder. Conversations died mid-sentence. Cameras froze, then exploded into chaos. Damien staggered half a step, more shocked than hurt, his head snapping to the side, his cheek blooming red beneath the lights. For the first time in years, maybe ever, Damien Cross looked human, vulnerable, exposed. Lena stood there, chest rising and falling, her hand still trembling in the air as if it, too, couldn't believe what it had done. That, she said, her voice steady despite the storm inside her, was for everything you took and pretended never happened. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone shouted her name. Security finally rushed in, hands reaching for her arms, but she didn't resist. She didn't need to. The damage was done. Damien lifted a hand slowly, stopping them. His eyes were locked on Lena's, a war of memories exploding between them in silence. Years ago, before the suits and the billions, before the private jets and headlines, there had been a different Damien. Hungrier, poorer, raw. And Lena had been there then, not as an accessory, not as a trophy, but as a partner. They had met when ambition was still fragile and hope still dangerous, when dreams were scribbled on napkins instead of signed into contracts. She had believed in him when no one else did, had worked double shifts to help him fund ideas no investor would touch, had slept on cold floors and eaten cheap meals while telling him he was destined for more. And he had promised her everything. But somewhere along the climb, Damien had learned a brutal lesson. That love slowed you down, that loyalty was a liability, and that some sacrifices were easier when they belonged to someone else. He had left Lena behind without ceremony, without closure, replacing her with silence and success. Now, standing under the unforgiving glare of public attention, he felt the weight of that choice like a hand around his throat. The crowd buzzed with speculation, phones already uploading clips that would spread across the internet in minutes. Billionaire slapped by ex-girlfriend. Public humiliation. What did she mean by everything you took? Damien straightened his jacket, forcing composure back into his bones. This is not the time or place, he said quietly. But Lena laughed, a short, bitter sound that carried farther than she intended. You don't get to decide that anymore, she replied. You decided years ago, remember? Her words cut deeper than the slap. Damien's mind raced, calculating damage control, legal angles, PR statements. But beneath all of that, something else stirred. Fear. Because Lena hadn't come here for drama. She hadn't come for revenge alone. She had come because something unresolved had finally grown too heavy to carry in silence. As security escorted her away, she leaned in close enough that only he could hear her final words. You built your empire on a lie, she whispered. And tonight, I just reminded the world where it started. Damien watched her disappear into the crowd, his reflection staring back at him from every camera lens, fractured and unfamiliar. Applause tried to restart. Music resumed awkwardly, but the night was already ruined. Inside him, doors he had locked tight were cracking open, memories seeping through like smoke. The slap wasn't just an act of anger. It was a signal, a warning. Whatever Lena carried with her wasn't finished with him yet. And for the first time since becoming a billionaire, Damien Cross felt something he hadn't felt in years. The terrifying sense that no amount of money could protect him from what was coming next. The aftermath of the slap followed Damien Cross like a shadow he couldn't outrun. By the time he retreated into the hotel's private elevator, away from cameras and forced smiles, his face had returned to its usual calm. But inside, everything was fractured. The doors closed with a soft chime, sealing him into silence. And suddenly the years he had worked so hard to forget rushed back with ruthless clarity. Lena's eyes haunted him. Not angry, not hysterical. Focused, determined. That was what unsettled him the most. Anger burned out. Determination didn't. As the elevator ascended, Damien loosened his tie, his fingers unsteady despite his efforts to remain composed. His phone buzzed incessantly. PR team, legal counsel, board members. But he ignored it all. For once, strategy could wait. The past had found him, and it was demanding to be seen. He remembered Lena not as the woman in the plaza, but as a girl who had once laughed at his terrible coffee, who had challenged his ideas instead of worshiping them. They met more than a decade ago in a rundown co-working space that smelled of burnt wires and cheap ambition. Damien had been brilliant but reckless, overflowing with ideas and empty pockets. Lena had been practical, sharp, and grounding. She believed in his vision not because it sounded impressive, but because she saw the work behind it. When he talked about changing industries, she asked how. When he talked about becoming rich, she asked why. She was the only one who didn't blindly applaud him. And somehow, that made him trust her more than anyone. In those early years, they were inseparable. Lena wasn't just his girlfriend. She was his backbone. She helped refine proposals, caught errors in contracts, and even loaned him money she couldn't afford to lose. When his first startup nearly collapsed, it was Lena who convinced him not to sell the remaining assets for pennies. "You're not failing," she had told him then. "You're just early." That sentence stayed with him long after she didn't. But success has a way of sharpening fear. When Damien's ideas finally caught the attention of investors, the stakes changed. The boardrooms were cold, filled with men who measured worth in numbers and weaknesses in relationships. One advisor had said it bluntly: "You can't afford emotional distractions. Investors don't like complications." At first, Damien laughed it off. Then he noticed how often Lena was excluded from meetings, how her presence made some executives uncomfortable. Not because she lacked intelligence, but because she saw through their games. Slowly, he began to distance himself, telling himself it was temporary, that once stability came, he'd bring her back into everything. But the more power he gained, the easier it became to justify silence. The night he ended things with Lena still replayed in his mind like a scene from a film he couldn't stop watching. There was no dramatic argument, no screaming match, just cold efficiency. He told her he needed space, that the pressure was too much, that this, meaning them, was holding him back. Lena had stared at him, stunned, waiting for the joke that never came. "You don't mean that," she had said quietly. But he did. Or at least, he convinced himself he did. He walked away that night believing he had chosen ambition over love, not realizing he had also chosen cowardice. Now, years later, Damien stood alone in his penthouse suite, city lights sprawling beneath him like a kingdom he had conquered, and felt no victory at all. His phone finally stopped buzzing, replaced by the hum of his thoughts. The media had already turned the incident into spectacle. Headlines speculated wildly. Some painted Lena as a jealous ex seeking attention. Others hinted at dark secrets behind Damien's rise. His PR director left a message insisting they frame the incident as harassment, advising a restraining order if necessary. Damien deleted it without responding. Something told him that fighting Lena publicly would only make things worse. Across the city, Lena sat in a modest apartment that felt far too small for the weight she carried. Her hands still shook when she replayed the moment in her head. The crack of skin against skin, the shock on Damien's face. She hadn't planned to slap him. She had planned to confront him. Yes, but the rage and years of restraint had collided in a single instant. Yet despite the chaos she had caused, Lena felt strangely calm. For the first time in years, she had said something out loud. What the world didn't know, what Damien had never bothered to learn, was what happened to Lena after he left. The emotional fallout was only the beginning. When Damien cut ties, he also erased her from the company's early records, reassigning credit, dissolving informal agreements, and ensuring that legally she had never existed in his story. The work she had done, the frameworks, the research, the connections became his alone. When she tried to fight it, she ran into walls built by expensive lawyers and non-disclosure agreements she had been pressured into signing without understanding their consequences. Broke, exhausted, and betrayed, Lena disappeared from the world Damien dominated. But she didn't disappear from life. She rebuilt herself quietly, took jobs beneath her abilities, learned the system she once believed in had no mercy for people without leverage. Over time, her bitterness hardened into clarity. She studied corporate law, finance, and intellectual property, not to become rich, but to understand how power really worked. And in the process, she uncovered something that made her blood run cold. A critical piece of Damien's empire, the algorithm that launched his company into dominance, was based on work she had created during those early years. Work that had never been properly transferred, licensed, or legally secured. At the time, she hadn't known its value. Now it was worth billions. That realization changed everything. Back in his penthouse, Damien poured himself a drink he didn't want and stared out the window. Lena's words echoed in his head. You built your empire on a lie. He told himself she was exaggerating, emotional, trying to hurt him. But doubt crept in where certainty once lived. He had always known the early days were messy, legally ambiguous. He had chosen not to look too closely because success had validated him. Or so he thought. When his legal counsel finally reached him, the tone was urgent. Damien, the lawyer, said, "We've run a preliminary check. Lena Harper's name appears in several early development documents. If she really pushes, it could be catastrophic." Damien closed his eyes. The fear he felt now was different from the fear of failure. This was exposure. This was consequence. Across town, Lena opened her laptop and stared at a single file on her screen. Inside it were years of documentation, emails, drafts, timestamps, proof she had once been more than just a woman beside him. She didn't smile. She didn't feel victorious. This was revenge. This was reckoning. The slap had only been the beginning. What came next would force Damien Cross to confront not just the woman he wronged, but the truth he had buried beneath his billions. And this time, there would be no elevator ride high enough to escape it. The morning after the gala, Damien Cross woke to a world that no longer bowed automatically. His phone lay face down on the nightstand, vibrating in short, aggressive bursts, like a living thing demanding attention. For years, waking up as Damien meant control, markets reacted to his words. People waited for his decisions. This morning felt different. The air itself seemed heavier, as if the city knew something he didn't want to admit. When he finally picked up the phone, the damage was already done. The video of the slap had crossed continents overnight. Every angle, every slow-motion replay, every headline screaming speculation. Billionaire publicly assaulted by X. Who is Lena Harper? Dark secrets behind Damien Cross's rise? Hashtags trended, opinions hardened, and armchair analysts dissected his expression frame by frame. The slap had become a symbol, not just an incident, and symbols were dangerous. Damien dressed in silence and headed to headquarters earlier than usual. The glass tower that once felt like a fortress now looked exposed, transparent in a way that made him uneasy. Inside the executive boardroom, his senior team waited. Lawyers, PR strategists, advisors who had survived 100 crises. But none like this. The usual confidence in the room was fractured, replaced by clipped voices and cautious glances. His chief legal officer spoke first, her tone clinical but strained. Lena Harper has retained counsel, she said. Not just any counsel. She's hired Marcus Vail. The name landed like a blow. Vail was known for dismantling empires with patience and precision. He didn't chase headlines. He chased outcomes. They laid out the risk in cold detail. If Lena could establish joint intellectual contribution, if she could prove coercion in those early NDAs, if she could show intentional erasure, then Damien's flagship company wasn't just vulnerable. It was contaminated at its core. Investors would panic. Partners would flee. Competitors would circle like sharks. Damien listened, jaw tight, anger simmering beneath restraint. "We can settle," someone suggested. Quietly, Damien shook his head. A settlement would be an admission, and admissions were weaknesses the market punished without mercy. Across the city, Lena sat in Marcus Vail's understated office, sunlight slanting through tall windows onto stacks of carefully labeled files. There was no celebration here, no righteous excitement, just focus. Marcus listened as Lena spoke, occasionally nodding, occasionally asking questions that forced her to slow down and breathe. When she finished, he leaned back and steepled his fingers. "You're not just fighting for compensation," he said. "You're challenging a narrative that's been accepted as truth. That means resistance, brutal resistance." Lena met his gaze. "I know," she said. "I lived it." What she didn't say out loud was that she had already survived the worst of it, being erased, doubted, and discarded. Everything after that was survivable. By midday, cracks began to show. A major partner announced a temporary review of its relationship with Damien's company. A board member resigned, pending clarity. Stock dipped, not enough to crash, but enough to signal fear. Damien felt each shift like a personal insult. He had always believed his genius insulated him from consequences. Now he realized how fragile reputation truly was, built over years, damaged in moments. That afternoon, an email arrived that Damien couldn't ignore. It wasn't from a lawyer or an investor. It was from Lena. The subject line was simple: "We need to talk." For a long moment, he stared at it, his finger hovering over the screen. Every instinct screamed to let his legal team handle it, to avoid direct contact. But something deeper, something human, pulled at him. He replied with two words he hadn't said to her in years. Where and when. They met in a quiet cafe far from the city's power corridors, a place that smelled of roasted beans and anonymity. Lena arrived first, calm but guarded. Damien walked in moments later, the room falling subtly silent as people recognized him. He sat across from her, searching for the woman he once knew in the stranger before him. "You didn't have to do this publicly," he began, voice low. Lena didn't flinch. "You didn't have to erase me privately," she replied. The simplicity of her words hurt more than accusation. They spoke for over an hour, circling the truth like wary opponents. Damien admitted fear, pressure, the ruthless advice he had followed. Lena spoke of loss, of rebuilding, of watching his success while struggling to survive. When he finally asked why now, why the slap, why the exposure, Lena's eyes hardened. "Because you were being celebrated for something you didn't build alone," she said. "And because the silence was killing me." Damien had no answer for that. News of their meeting leaked within hours. Analysts speculated reconciliation. Others predicted war. Behind closed doors, investors demanded reassurance. Damien felt squeezed from all sides, by law, by public opinion, by a past he could no longer outrun. For the first time, he questioned the story he had told himself for years, that survival required sacrifice, that success justified the casualties left behind. That night, alone again, Damien reviewed the early documents Lena's lawyer had shared under confidentiality. Seeing her annotations, her fingerprints on ideas he claimed as solely his, was unsettling. It wasn't that he hadn't known. He had simply chosen not to care. The realization didn't just threaten his empire. It threatened his identity. As Lena returned home, she felt the exhaustion she had postponed finally settle into her bones. Confronting Damien hadn't brought closure, only clarity. The fight ahead would be long, vicious, and public. But for the first time, she wasn't alone. She had truth, evidence, and a voice people were finally listening to. Power, Damien was learning, didn't disappear all at once. It cracked, slowly, painfully, until the person holding it had to decide whether to let it shatter or to face what lay beneath. The trial didn't begin with fireworks. There were no dramatic speeches, no shouted accusations, no cinematic moments that the public expected. Instead, it began quietly, almost respectfully, in a courtroom where power was stripped down to evidence, testimony, and truth. Yet despite the calm surface, everyone knew this case was seismic. Lena Harper versus Damian Cross wasn't just a legal battle. It was a reckoning. From the first day, the courtroom was packed. Journalists filled every bench. Sketch artists worked nonstop, and the world watched through screens as the man once seen as untouchable sat stiffly beside his legal team. Damian looked smaller here. Not poor, not weak, but human. His confidence, once effortless, now required concentration. Across the aisle, Lena sat upright, hands folded, eyes forward. She didn't look triumphant. She looked resolved. Marcus Vail opened the case not by attacking Damien, but by telling a story of beginnings, of two people building something from nothing, of long nights, unpaid labor, shared dreams, and uncredited work. He spoke slowly, methodically, laying a foundation brick by brick. Emails were introduced, timestamps showing Lena's involvement in critical development phases, drafts of code, notes in her handwriting, early pitch decks where her language shaped the vision investors later praised. The courtroom murmured as the picture became impossible to ignore. Damien's lawyers fought back hard. They questioned relevance. They challenged authenticity. They implied bitterness, motive, exaggeration. They painted Lena as someone who had benefited emotionally, but walked away empty-handed, because she chose not to secure her place. But every attempt to diminish her story was met with another document, another witness, another quiet confirmation that she had been there and erased. When Lena took the stand, the room stilled. She spoke without theatrics, without tears, without hatred. She spoke like someone who had rehearsed the truth not to persuade others, but to survive herself. She described how she had trusted Damien, how she had signed documents she didn't fully understand because she believed partnership meant protection. She described the moment she realized she had been cut out, not just of the company, but of a narrative. It wasn't the money that broke me, she said softly. It was being told I never mattered. Then came the moment everyone waited for. Damian Cross was called to testify. He walked to the stand with the weight of decades on his shoulders. The oath felt heavier than any contract he had ever signed. When Marcus Vail questioned him, it wasn't with hostility. It was with precision. Did Lena Harper contribute to the early development of your company's core technology? Damien hesitated. That hesitation echoed louder than any denial. He looked at Lena, then away. Yes, he said finally. The word rippled through the room. And why was her contribution never acknowledged? Silence stretched. Damien swallowed. Because I was afraid, he admitted. Afraid of losing control. Afraid of looking replaceable. In that moment, the billionaire mask cracked completely. The verdict came weeks later. The court ruled that Lena Harper was a co-creator of the foundational intellectual property that built Damien's empire. She was awarded significant ownership, retroactive compensation, and public acknowledgement. The ruling sent shockwaves through the business world. Stocks dipped sharply, partnerships were renegotiated, and Damien's image shifted overnight, from visionary hero to cautionary tale. But the biggest surprise wasn't the verdict. It was Damien's response. At the press conference that followed, he didn't deflect. He didn't blame advisors. He didn't hide behind legal language. He stood alone at the podium and spoke plainly. I built my success on brilliance and fear, he said. And fear made me dishonest. Lena Harper deserved recognition long ago. I failed her. Today's ruling doesn't take something from me. It returns something I should never have taken. The statement stunned the public. Some called it calculated. Others called it rare. Lena watched from home, her expression unreadable. Apologies didn't rewrite history, but acknowledgement mattered. In the months that followed, life changed for both of them. Lena didn't become flashy or public. She invested quietly, mentored women who had been overlooked, and helped build companies where credit was transparent and shared. Money gave her security, yes, but justice gave her peace. For the first time in years, she slept without rehearsing conversations that never happened. Damien stepped back from daily control of his empire. He remained wealthy, influential, but different. The loss of absolute power forced him to confront the cost of his ascent. In rare moment of honesty, he admitted that the slap in the plaza had saved him from becoming someone he no longer recognized. They didn't become friends. They didn't reconcile in the way stories often pretend people do. Some wounds leave scars even when they heal, but they reach an understanding rooted in truth, not illusion. Years later, when the story was taught in business schools, it wasn't framed as a scandal. It was framed as a lesson. That success built on erasure eventually demands repayment, that power without accountability fractures, and that voices ignored for too long have a way of being heard, sometimes with a slap that echoes around the world. And that night in the plaza, once dismissed as a moment of chaos, became remembered for what it truly was: the first crack in a lie too heavy to carry forever.